Hello, I'm Dr. Mira Irons, President and CEO of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Welcome to the latest in our series, College Conversations, Medicine, Science, and Society. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Paul Offit, Director of the Vaccine Education Center and Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as a fellow and member of the Board of Trustees of the college. Paul, it's been a month since we last spoke about COVID and monkeypox, and now polio has been added to the list of infectious diseases that have appeared in the U.S. that we hoped we wouldn't see again. So I'd like to spend some time getting your views and your wisdom on both monkeypox and polio, but I can't help but begin with a question about COVID vaccines. Is there any new information about the availability of bivalent vaccines that also target the Omicron variant in the rapidly approaching fall, more traditional respiratory season? And how should people who have gotten a second booster think about a new bivalent vaccine that might appear in a few months?
Certainly the notion of having a bivalent vaccine to broaden immunity, especially against Omicron, BA1, and the Omicron subvariants, meaning BA5, BA4, BA2.121, makes sense because Omicron crossed the line. I mean, this was an immune evasive strain. Even if you'd been naturally infected or you'd been vaccinated or both, you still could get a mild disease with Omicron or the Omicron subvariant. So it made sense to expand your repertoire, if you will. The question is, do we have data that show that that happened? Now, on June 28th, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, on which I sit, did meet to discuss that. And what both Moderna and Pfizer showed, that if you gave 3 doses of the current vaccine, the ancestral strain vaccine, and then boosted with either the ancestral strain vaccine or boosted with a bivalent vaccine that contained the ancestral strain and then the other strain was Omicron, meaning BA1. And then they looked at neutralizing antibodies against Omicron, BA1. And what they found was that depending on how you did that study, whether it was a 30 microgram dose with Pfizer, or a 60 microgram dose with Pfizer, or a 25 microgram dose with Moderna, you had an increase in neutralizing antibodies with the bivalent strain of between 1.5 and 2-fold as compared to getting boosted with the ancestral strain. That's not a dramatic result. In fact, when data were presented to our committee back in December of 2020, looking at Moderna and Pfizer's vaccine, Moderna had roughly a 2-fold increase in neutralizing antibodies, which, while statistically significant, really wasn't clinically significant in terms of protection against serious disease for the long term, which is the goal of these vaccines. So I think that, in combination with the fact that Omicron BA1 is gone, I mean, now you're talking about BA4, BA5, so you really want to see those data, the BA4, BA5 data, sort of caused me to vote no. I would just say this. I think that before we all uniformly run to what likely is going to be a bivalent vaccine that has the ancestral strain and BA5, we should really hold the administration's feet to the fire to show us clear data that the kind of neutralizing antibody response that you're getting is likely to be predictive of better protection against clinical disease, because right now those data don't exist.
Okay, great, thanks. Shifting gears a little, when we last spoke, monkeypox numbers were low, but increasing. Since then, there have been over 400 reported cases in the United States and over 20,000 globally in 77 countries, 71 of which have historically not reported monkeypox. The WHO declared monkeypox a public health emergency. San Francisco did so as well, and possibly New York. What should people know about monkeypox transmission, symptoms, and vaccines?
Well, the vast majority of transmissions are in men who have sex with men, accounting for more than 90% of those cases. The transmission is most commonly by skin-to-skin contact. The good news is there have been no deaths, at least as of today, that I know of in the United States from this virus. The other good news, I guess, is if you are exposed, if you know you've been exposed, then within 4 days of exposure, you can get a vaccine. The 2 vaccines that are available, one is the so-called ACAM 2000 vaccine, which is basically like the original Dryvax vaccine from Wyeth, which is given by a scarification route. That's kind of a live weakened form of the virus. And then there's the so-called modified vaccinia ankara vaccine, which is basically non-replicating virus. It's much safer. So those are the 2 vaccines that are available. So I think that's the good news. It's not smallpox. I mean, smallpox had a case fatality rate of 33%. That's not this virus. Smallpox also, for those who survived, had a large percentage of people who were left blind, and that was a much, much worse virus. But again, it is in that orthopox virus family, needs to be taken seriously. And I think this is something we can get a hold of. We just have to try and make sure that the practices that are engaged in by men who have sex with men really tries to avoid having contact with people who are currently infected.
Great, thank you. Of more concern, let's talk about polio. As noted by a post by Scientific American online July 25th, quote, "The first case of polio in the US since 2013 was announced by New York State health officials on July 21st, 2022. The US resident had not been vaccinated. Polio was a common cause of paralysis in children before safe and effective vaccines were invented in the mid-20th century. Thanks to global vaccination campaigns, polio is now almost eradicated, with only 13 cases of endemic wild poliovirus reported in 2022 to date worldwide," unquote. And here we are with a new case in New York. What can you tell us about how this came about? What does it mean in the United States and globally?
We're never going to eliminate polio until we eliminate use of the oral polio vaccine. And I'll explain what I mean. So Jonah created his inactivated poliovirus vaccine in 1955, which is to say, take poliovirus, grow it up in cell culture, purify it, kill it with a chemical. We used that vaccine from 1955 to 1961. That vaccine was then replaced in the early 1960s by Albert Sabin's vaccine. His vaccine was made differently. What he did was he took poliovirus, grew it up again in monkey kidney cells or monkey testicular cells, and weakened it in much the same manner that we have live attenuated virus vaccines against measles or mumps or German measles or chickenpox or yellow fever, which is actually where Albert Sabin trained in that lab, Max Heiler's lab at Rockefeller, where the yellow fever vaccine was made. So what he did was now he has a live attenuated viral vaccine that we use in this country from the early 1960s up until the year 2000, and then switched back to the inactivated vaccine, which was the right thing to do. The problem with the oral polio vaccine was, although it worked well to eliminate the virus polio from this country, which we'd done by the 1970s, in fact, eliminated poliovirus from the Western Hemisphere by the early 1990s, the problem with the oral polio vaccine is that it really, although it is attenuated for growth in the central nervous system, it is not attenuated for growth in the intestine. And when you give that virus, it reproduces itself again and again and again in the intestine. Because it's a single-stranded RNA virus, its replication is not highly faithful, and it can mutate. And it can actually mutate back to neurovirulent type, so that you can actually have essentially what is vaccine-derived paralytic polio. And that's what this man in Rockland County, New York had, which he probably picked up from traveling in Hungary and Poland and presumably in areas where the oral polio vaccine is still used. What worries me here is that he comes back to an under-vaccinated community in Rockland County, thus precipitating a lot of people in that county getting a polio vaccine that they never got. This particular virus that he had reproduces itself well in the intestine. It can be spread to others. When you see him having a case of paralysis, realize that only 1 in 200 people who are infected with polio will be paralyzed by it. So he represents the tip of a much larger iceberg. And again, I just want to make the point that we are never going to eliminate polio from this world until we eliminate the use of the oral polio vaccine, because it can revert to essentially neurovirulent type, and that has become more common as a cause of paralysis than wild type virus.
For all of the people that have been vaccinated in the United States with oral polio vaccine between 1960 and 2000, how protected are they? Is travel an issue? I mean, what would you counsel people? I mean, it's early at this point, but any thoughts on what to tell people?
Sure. So if you were a child of the 1950s, you probably started by getting the inactivated polio vaccine. And then actually, as we switched to the oral polio vaccine, there was a period of time where you could have gotten both, the inactivated vaccine, then the oral vaccine. Then since the early 60s, only the oral vaccine. That is a highly protected vaccine. And you have long-lived protection. I think that's the good news. And if you have been born since 2000, you got the inactivated vaccine, which also induces long-lived protection. So I think if you've gotten the polio vaccine, I think you're protected. That's the good news. But it makes the point that you should be vaccinated because these viruses are still out there. And I think that's what this Rockland County case teaches us, because we're scared when you see a case of paralytic disease come into that county, which is under-vaccinated, that it could spread. We need to keep vaccinating. What worries me now in this pandemic era of COVID is that we have generally an under-vaccinated children's group because they haven't gotten vaccinated, because the pandemic has kind of disrupted the infrastructure of vaccination.
Right, right. And, just to get to this underrepresented vaccinated group in children, what concerned me during the pandemic and even now is that some of the concerns that mothers are having with regards to the COVID vaccine is leaking over into other childhood vaccines. It's almost as though the anti-vaccination group is growing because of the issues that have come up with COVID in general, writ large, and is sort of bleeding over into other childhood vaccines. And many of the people making decisions about vaccination for their children never lived in a world where they ever saw polio, or for that matter, H flu or pneumococcal vaccine or rubella or measles. How do you think about that? I mean, is there a way to turn that boat around?
Maurice Hilleman, who I consider to be the father of modern vaccines, because he was involved in the primary research and development on 9 of the 14 vaccines we currently give to children. Towards the end of his life, he allowed me to interview him, which I did for a book that I ultimately wrote about him. But I asked him that question late in his life, when he saw the anti-vaccine movement taking hold, when he saw people rejecting vaccines, his vaccines, that he knew worked well to prevent disease. And I said to him, do you think there's any way we're going to be able to educate people about the importance of vaccine without watching children once again suffer these diseases? And it was a January day. He sort of looked out his back window and stared for a while, and then he looked back at me and he said, no, I think the only way we're going to be able to educate people about the importance of vaccines is to watch these diseases come back. And sadly, I think he's right. I mean, if you watch somebody like Jenny McCarthy, when she was on the Oprah Winfrey Show and launching her career as an anti-vaccine activist, she said, wrongly assuming that the combination measles, mumps, rubella, or MMR vaccine caused autism, she said, I'll take the measles every time, which tells you that not only have we largely eliminated measles, we've eliminated the memory of measles, we've eliminated the memory of polio. Right. That's where the danger lies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's my concern here, is that saying I'll take measles anytime or I'll take rubella anytime, you can't really say that if you don't know what that means. And I think that memory is only there for people now in their 60s and 70s and 80s. I think grandparents may have that memory, right? But I don't think that a lot of parents have that lived mememory.
No, you're right. Or doctors.
Or doctors, you're right.
When a child with a fever and a rash comes into our house, well, sometimes people will ask me to come down to the emergency room. They ask old people like me, because I've seen a lot of measles. And you can tell within 30 seconds whether somebody has measles, because they're sick. They're often photophobic with a mild encephalopathy, looking down. They're miserable, much different than other viruses that cause a kind of fever and a rash.
Right. All right. Well, any final thoughts? Always ask that.
No, I think I'm trying to end on a positive note. I do think we have a fairly high level of population immunity now with COVID, either from natural infection, immunization, or both. And it'll be curious to see what happens over this winter. I really do think we're going to have a lesser bump this winter than we had in the previous 2 winters associated with children going back to school and stuff. But we'll see, because I'm often wrong about this. But I'm going to still try and have a positive note here. Although I should put it in context, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder, so I'm wildly optimistic.
All right. Well, Paul, thank you. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to talk. And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back again with another episode of College Conversations, Medicine, Science, and Society soon.